How many of you have played that game of Jenga? It's a fun game to play with friends. It requires a bit of strategy, a little bit of foresight, some skill, and of course, some luck. Although it isn't necessarily as mentally challenging as other board games, there is one thing with a little bit of reflection you can learn from playing Jenga: the importance of integrity. Jenga is a game where players slowly erode the structural integrity of a tower of interconnected blocks. In the first few rounds, removing a block and placing it on top of the other blocks seems to have little impact on the stability of the tower, but as the game proceeds, the removal of one more block exposes the fragility of the tower's ability to maintain its vertical position until finally that one block causes its complete collapse. And it seems that rebuilding the tower often takes more time than destroying it. So how do we apply this idea of integrity of the Jenga tower to integrity in leadership? Warren Buffett once noted in reference to operating with integrity, and I quote, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently," end quote. There are two challenges in Buffett's comment. The first is actually the one that requires thinking. How often do we talk about integrity in leadership? Within your own organization, how much time is spent in your leadership development sessions and leader meetings discussing values and principles and what it means to operate with integrity? How often do you share stories and examples of situations that may have challenged those principles and discussed how you dealt with them to maintain integrity? How much time, in Buffett's words, is spent building that reputation? To lead with integrity begins with thinking about the principles by which you will lead. How will you treat your team? How do you expect them to treat each other? How will decisions be made? What authority will you give your team to make decisions? How will you address the team taking risks? And how will you deal with plans that don't go as expected? How are priorities set? And how does your team help establish those? These are just a few questions that any leader must answer for themselves and then articulate to their teams. But why spend this time to define principles? Well, there are a number of reasons, but here are three important ones. First, defining your leadership principles is actually a critical step in empowering your team. You can think of it as setting the rules of a game like Jenga. Without principles to guide the team's behavior and to clarify expectations around how they will work together, you can expect one of two outcomes: team anarchy or team inertia. Most of us don't like anarchy very much. It often leads to a lack of focus and unintended consequences, making it difficult to redirect the team and drive performance. Put more simply, people kind of get out of control and it's hard to rein them back in. And team inertia only leads to a slow degradation in team performance as risk is avoided and innovation in turn becomes non-existent. The second reason articulating and adhering to principles is so important is it builds both team and organizational credibility. How? Well, it forces you to align your team's capabilities with the goals they are expected to achieve. So let's take an easy example. If your team is responsible for providing great customer service, then you need to give them the authority to solve a customer's problem. But how much authority? Well, that's going to depend on the level of service you hope to provide and the problems that customers typically need resolved. But you know that with limited ability to solve problems, you can rest assured customers will not be satisfied with your service, and it will not really be considered a top priority. Principles that align with the achievement of a team's goals builds both team and organizational credibility. In other words, you are what you say you are. The third reason builds off the first two. Principles consistently applied build leader and team trust. And trust is really the superpower of high-performing teams. Without trust, teams tend to take fewer risks, which limits innovation, and which in turn limits continually improving team performance. I don't know about you, but when I listen and read and engage with leaders today, it surprises me how little time is spent reflecting on integrity and leadership at a time when we seem to see little of it on display. Like the Jenga game, every story is another block removed from the tower, and our collective view of integrity and leadership is slowly being eroded. But we can change that as individual leaders. And here's a first step we can all take right now to reflect and recommit ourselves to leading with integrity. Take a moment to think about your own operating principles and ask yourself, have you defined them clearly for yourself? And can you articulate them clearly to your team? Operating principles should address at least 3 key areas. How do we communicate and interact with our team and broader organization? For example, we can say we communicate with urgency and understanding. We deal with each other with respect, but importantly, how do those words translate into behaviors? What does that look like within your team? The second issue to address is organization. How do we organize to be efficient in our work and effective in delivering our results? For example, you could say team structure and skills should mirror the complexity of the problem, the effort to solve it, and the impact of the solution. In other words, don't over-engineer team performance to solve problems. How do we decision in a way that promotes growth and innovation is the third important consideration. For example, big decisions warrant big discussions and, most importantly, big disagreements, because it's important to have a diversity of different views and taking risk, particularly large risk, to ensure we think about and optimize the decision to be made and the team is aligned around it. These are just a few examples of things to consider in restoring leadership integrity. In my next video, I'll share more thoughts on integrity and the challenge of maintaining it. Until then, in every interaction with your team, remember to lead with I care. See you next time.